Hey adventurers, so today is going to be my review of Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This is of course this is of course his secret novel #1 as of Tuesday the 11th, I believe it was, or something, whenever that day was. I think it was the 11th, maybe it was the 10th. I think maybe it was the 10th, that sounds right. He and his team, Dragonsteel and Tor and everybody, has started using the title rather than Secret Project #1. So I will also not feel bad about using the title. And that is, of course, Tress of the Emerald Sea. So this is my review of that book, if I didn't already mention that. Anyways, it's a fantasy. It's told in a fairy tale way. It's also seafaring adventure, and of course it's part of his Cosmere. So Tress of the Emerald Sea, or Secret Project #1, as I mentioned, is the first of Sanderson's 4 secret novels that he wrote and is being released in 2023. So this is his month, or his Q1 book release. He'll have a Q2, Q3, and Q4 book release. And yeah. So on January 1st, first day of Q1, I received the audio and ebook versions of Tress of the Emerald Sea. And though I didn't actually start listening to the book, I listened to the audiobook because I don't like e-reading, especially since I have to e-read on my phone. So I listened to the audiobook and I finished it. I started it on the 3rd and I finished it on the 4th. So it took me less than a day, and it's not a terribly long book. But also it didn't need to be terribly long. It was the way that the story was told and the type of story that it was telling. It could be wrapped up in, I believe the ebook edition is about 480 pages, which is pretty short for a Sanderson. That's shorter, that's a little bit longer than Era 2, Mistborn, I think, but not that much longer than those, and shorter by far than even Era 1. So let's see, where we at? I don't really feel like this is Sanderson's absolute best work that he's ever done, and I don't really feel like it's my favorite either, but it was very, very enjoyable. It is a fun, whimsical story, and one that is very different, and one that, while very different from things like Mistborn or Stormlight, it still absolutely feels like it fits into the Cosmere, with a tone that's closer to Warbreaker than it is to really any of his other Cosmere novels. So while I say that it's closer to Warbreaker, it's actually not at all like Warbreaker even. It's more YA than Warbreaker is in many ways. But still an adult fantasy book, just written in a very much later whimsical term. I don't know what the words are, but you get what I'm saying. It's not as heavy as Stormlight or Mistborn. It is quite possibly my favorite Cosmere world at this point, though. I just the way that the world worked in this novel was so cool. It was a new planet, as with most of the Cosmere stuff. They're set on their own planets, and the world of Tress of the Emerald Sea and everything about it was so super cool to me, and I think it's probably my favorite world to this point. The goal of this story is not to tell some grand sweeping epic fantasy story, but instead to basically have a fairy tale in the same vein as The Princess Bride. And that's exactly what it is. Everyone else, including Sanderson himself, has already talked about his inspirations for this book, in that he was wanting to write a book for his wife, and that he got the idea for this book after watching The Princess Bride with his family. There's more to it than that. That's the general gist of it. Go listen to him talk about it, or really any other person who has reviewed this book. I don't feel like I need to talk about that, because everybody else already has. The magic system of this world is both extremely fleshed out and not at all. That is to say, the magic that happens is well developed, but the world itself doesn't seem to actually have its own magic system. And that's an interesting dichotomy, something that Sanderson doesn't usually do, but I think it works because we know that this is getting into Cosmere lore, kind of Cosmere spoilers, but if you don't know the Cosmere, why are you watching this book or this review to begin with? Kind of thing. And also, if you don't know the Cosmere, it's not going to make sense to you, and that's fine. If you do know the Cosmere, then you're going to understand what I'm saying. But basically, from what I understand of the Cosmere, the magic systems come from the different shards, essentially. That's not quite exactly it, but it's something along those lines, where if there's a shard present, then there's a magic system present with that as well. And so the way that this world works, there's not really a magic system in that same way. it is a hard magic system where the oceans are not made up of water, but rather of spores that fall from the 12 moons of the planet. Each different type of spore reacts differently to water. Verdant spores react by producing vines, crimson spores produce extremely sharp and hard spines, etc. So it's a fantasy world where the oceans are not made of water. They are affected by water, but they are not made of water, and they are basically, the way that I see it, it's basically just almost like sand, and then you sail on them because there's air bubbles basically that come up from below that liquefy the spores, or it's like when you liquefy sand by blowing air bubbles up underneath it. It's the same process. I want to say it's called liquefaction or something like that. Anyways, you can look it up. There's other people who know it way better than I do. I just know that it's possible, and because of that, the way that it works is super cool. The bubbles stop and you're trapped. It's hard ground at that point. It's solid like sand is solid, and that's really cool. One of the things that really sets this story apart is that it is told by Hoyd. The voice that is used here is much more lighthearted and whimsical, and though there is a level of seriousness to it, it doesn't take itself too seriously. Hoyd, as the narrator, knows what he is doing and is telling a tale specifically to get to the point at the end where he can explain the moral of the story, kind of. That's not exactly right. It's also just a Sanderson book, but it is told kind of, because it's told like a fairy tale, there is kind of like a moral that is brought out at the end, and that's the way that it is, and that Hoyd tells the story up to that point so that he can kind of tell this moral, and it's really well done in that way. It works extremely well, and though I don't always love Sanderson's humor, the voice that this was written in worked really well for me for this story. I can't say that I'd want a bunch of books written in this voice, but for the occasional one, especially for tales written specifically like this fairy tale, I liked it and it worked really well. Overall, I very much enjoyed this story. And though I'm not terribly well versed in Cosmere lore, there's some people, tons and tons of people who know the Cosmere way, way better than I ever will. And that's fine, I don't care to study it that much. But even though I'm not that well versed in the Cosmere lore, there is still a ton in this book that I was like, oh, I recognize that, oh, I recognize that, I know what that's from, and there just lots of stuff and lots of Easter eggs, as it were, as people call them sometimes. And I liked that. It was cool that they were obvious enough for me to see, but they also didn't take away from the story being told. It was an extremely fun, fast-paced, breath of fresh air in a way. It still felt like Sanderson, very much so, but it was definitely its own thing, and that I'd been reading quite a bit of heavier fantasy at that point. Rune Lords, while not being terribly dark, is rather a disturbing series in many ways the more you start thinking about the stuff. And so taking a break from like Rune Lords and some of these other things that I'd been reading and reading Tress of the Emerald Sea, it was just really nice. And pretty much Sanderson went out to write a certain type of book, and he wrote it, and it turned out really good. So I really enjoyed that. There's tons of other people who have great reviews of Tress of the Emerald Sea out already. I definitely recommend you go and watch those as well. Thank you guys for watching an Erudite Adventure. We post videos every Monday and Thursday. We have our social medias linked in the description down below, and we'll see you guys again soon. Thanks for watching. Stay warm.